Well, anybody who's been consistently watching my show knows that I am a huge fan of Yu Yu Hakusho, with good reason. I actually consider it to be one of the best shonen shows out there, leagues above things like Naruto and Bleach, though maybe on par with things like One Piece or Soul Eater. It's not a perfect show by any means, but I do consider it one of the best in its genre. Now, needless to say, with something that's been around that long, it has plenty of time to build up a fan following, and with a fan following comes merchandise, most likely for a series such as that, video games. While it's true many of the earlier games did not reach US shores, a modest amount of them and some of the later games did make it over here in English form. Now, none of them are particularly groundbreaking or all-time classics. They are anime licensed games after all, but the best of them are actually pretty good and a lot of fun to play, while the worst of them are just downright embarrassing. And keep in mind, they have been releasing games for this series since the Super Famicom era, so they've had a lot of time to get things right with the license. But boy, did they screw up this time. Today's installment for review is known as Yu Yu Hakusho Spirit Detective for the Game Boy Advance. This game was Atari's attempt to take the first few arcs of the anime, roughly from the very beginning to just before the Dark Tournament saga, and turn it into an isometric beat-em-up game. And on paper, that actually does sound like a pretty good idea. It seems like shonen shows are always destined to be turned into beat-em-ups, fighting games, or the occasional RPG, and Yu Yu Hakusho certainly seems like it would fit the bill for a beat-em-up. However, the first real misstep here is the fact that it's on a portable platform that really didn't have enough power to make a very interesting game, as we'll soon see. But that is really only the start of just how terrible this game is. I mean, almost no effort was really put into its game design. Now, I'm not going to bother recounting the story for you, mostly because, like I said, this is basically a watered-down transcription of the anime, which actually, in this case, is both good and bad. The good about it is that the creators actually did seem to know the source material, which of course is a big plus if you're trying to make a game based on something else. The script is peppered with quite a few of the show's most memorable lines from the beginning, and they did actually do their best to recreate all of the situations from the show. Though they failed miserably about that, but I'll get into that in a later date. Other than that, though, the other bad part about it is that it's a watered-down version of the show. Most of the dialogue, besides the quips from the show, are exposition, and there really isn't much dialogue in the stages themselves. The cutscenes themselves, though, are just little talky heads as well, so it really isn't that interesting, especially if you know the anime as well as fans of this thing probably do. The other big problem with this is that since it's so watered down and most of the dialogue is exposition, there's no room for drama or anything like that. One of the reasons I personally love the show so much is that there was a lot of character in it. There wasn't a whole lot of character development, but we learned quite a bit about the characters and who they were, and even though they only changed very slightly over the course of the show, they did change. It was subtle, and it was very nice to see that. But here, apart from the quips, which really don't make much sense in some contexts, it's all exposition. There's no real character here. But then again, this is a game for fans of the anime who probably already know the story. And besides, you can't really expect something like a deep narrative from a beat-em-up game. It just doesn't really happen. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at one of the most important aspects of the game, its gameplay. And this is where it really starts to hurt. The game plays like a standard isometric beat-em-up/adventure game. You're given objectives to meet, and you have to find your way to the objective on a giant maze-like map while beating up goons along the way. You lose if you either run out of time if it's a time challenge, or if your entire team is destroyed, which, trust me, will never happen in this game. But the first problem actually comes with the isometric perspective. You are constantly getting hung up on things you don't mean to, like corners or trees, because you can't see where the limits are on them. The other big problem is that it will take you forever to get absolutely anywhere in this game. While it is true that in the first few stages you're given a compass that helpfully points you in the direction that you're supposed to go to reach an objective, it only points you in the general direction. And the maps in this game are so huge and so maze-like that it's going to take you forever to get anywhere if you just try and follow a straight line. This isn't helped by the fact that you have to stop periodically to fight some random enemies that happen to pop up. Enemies that you probably could avoid, but they will follow you to the ends of the earth first, before they give up the chase. What's even worse about this is, in later stages, while it becomes much more linear, they take away the compass, and the isometric perspective still makes many of the maps very confusing to navigate. What's even worse about this is that many of the locations on the map look exactly the same as the rest of the map. There are one or two very distinct locations, but other than that, everything else looks the same, so it's almost impossible to memorize different positions on the map yourself. And then of course there's the matter of the combat, which is the heart and soul of any beat-em-up game, but here it is completely and utterly dull and worthless. The game is simple but extraordinarily frustrating. At the beginning of the game, all you have is your basic punch combo performed by pressing the A button, and rapidly pressing it is basically how you're going to kill most of the starting enemies. The problem with this is that the enemies are going to get in hits regardless of how aggressively you attack them. Even if you try to back up and then attack them again, they're still going to get hits in, and you have no way of blocking attacks. True, later on in the game you get more characters and each of them have their special spirit powers, but the only one that's actually worth a damn is Yusuke's shotgun and spirit gun attacks. Even when you're fighting a larger group of enemies, your tactics will never change. You'll always launch at them with a flurry of punches, and by the way, the hit detection is crapped all to hell, so you'll usually hit them even when they're standing next to you when you're punching forward, and then they'll hit you, and then you'll hit them, you'll back off, and so on and so forth until either you die or they die. The only time this ever varies is after Yusuke gets the ability to use his spirit gun, and then against some groups of enemies, you will back off and spam the spirit gun attack. Oh, and in case you think boss fights are going to be any different, no, they're not. In fact, most boss fights in this game are even easier than ordinary thug fights, because it's always a one-on-one fight. You usually have the ability to switch characters, though in some cases you can't, and you can usually win these fights just by running up and mashing the A button and running away and getting a health power up when you need to heal. Only rarely will you come across one where you actually need to take a more strategic approach, though the strategy usually just involves running around them and using Yusuke's spirit gun. Once again. In fact, here is the best way to beat almost every single boss in this game. Did I win? Now, I say that's how you'll win most of the time, but this game actually does have the audacity to try and throw in some gimmick matches as well. For example, in this fight, my attacks cannot pass over the barrier that's protecting the boss, so the only way to harm him is to redirect his heat-seeking shurikens back at him so that they hit him instead of me. It doesn't make much sense that my spirit gun can't pass over the barrier, but whatever. That's the least of this game's problems. Anyway, the real problem with this fight is that his attacks are so erratic and hard to control that it's almost impossible to efficiently redirect his shurikens back at him, which makes this fight much more frustrating than it is fun, and almost makes me yearn to go back to the monotony of just mashing the A or B button. And of course they tried to make it more interesting by making all of the 4 main characters playable. Once you meet them, you can switch between them all on the fly, but it doesn't really help much, mostly because their stats are so varied, and in this game the only one that you'll really want to play as is Yusuke, because as I've mentioned, he's the only one with a decent spirit technique, because it's the only one that has any sort of range, or you'll want to play as the character with the highest strength that can kill enemies with a basic combo the fastest, which in this game happens to be, Kuwabara. Really? I mean, don't get me wrong, Kuwabara is an awesome character and all, but throughout the series he was consistently shown to be the weakest in pretty much every aspect of the four main characters. Yeah. But aside from his apparent strength in this game, Kuwabara's spirit attack, the spirit sword, does way less damage than his ordinary combo, so it's almost not worth using, except against a later boss who you can't use your ordinary combo against. Kurama and Hiei in this game are almost practically wasted, because their ordinary combos do much less damage than Yusuke or Hiei's, so they're not good at physical combat, but at the same time, their spirit attacks are almost completely useless. Kurama's whip attack barely goes any further than his ordinary combo and barely does any more damage. Don't even get me started on how poor Hiei was shafted in this game. Of the four characters that you regularly play as, he is without a doubt the weakest character in terms of strength, taking many more hits than any other character to kill even the basic enemies. His spirit attacks are also really not that impressive, as all he ends up with is a stupid teleport technique that will not hurt any enemies, and even the teleport slash that he learns later on will still not hit any of the enemies. But wait, there's even more. You see, the designers were desperate to try and put in some variety, I think, so they also included a stage where you play as Keiko, Yusuke's boyfriend, and a stage where you play as Botan, the Grim Reaper of this game, which sounds awesome, but really isn't. In the Keiko stage, you're basically just running around a maze of an apartment trying to find Yusuke's body before the flames burn it up. How do you get through here? You run through the stage and you flip switches that magically turn off the fire. Ow. My intelligence. The Botan stage, while it sounds more interesting, is really even more boring than the Keiko stage. You run around the city, which is even more empty than usual, looking for people infected with demon insects. You hit them a bunch of times with a bat until they're knocked out, and then you spray the insects with bug spray after they fly out of their carcass. And you do this until you've killed at least 20 of these buggers, which takes a lot longer than it should, because nobody is anywhere in this city and you have nothing to guide you towards the next zombie. But one of the biggest disappointments about this game? It is extraordinarily easy and extraordinarily short, which is never a good combination unless you're trying to make a game for children. And this is obviously not a game that was meant for the young kiddies. The problem here is I've already explained how easy a lot of the combat is, but the game separates itself into 26 different stages, and of those 26, the longest one, the one that I took the most time on, probably took me about 15 minutes to beat. If you are good at these types of games, you can probably beat the entire story mode in under 3.5 hours. Oh, the game does try valiantly to give itself some replayability with 2 unlockable modes known as Tournament and Minigame, but neither of them are all that good. Minigame mode is basically just that, 3 short minigames that you were forced to play during the story mode a few times, but none of them are really that good or that engaging, to be honest. There's a Jonkin game where you just have to match your opponent in a game of rock, paper, scissors by choosing the option that would beat his option. It really just boils down to reaction time. Then there's a punching bag game where you basically do what you've been doing the entire game and mash the A button until the meter lights up and you're able to hit it in the target zone. And then finally there's a karaoke game, which is basically just a poor man's version of DDR. And by poor, I mean extraordinarily penniless. We're talking like Bob Cratchit's salary here. Now, while the tournament mode sounds like it could be the most interesting part of this game, it's really nothing more than a boss marathon. It is notable for being the only time in the game you can play as Genkai, but unfortunately, she's basically just a smaller version of Yusuke. She uses all of the same attacks as him, and the only difference between her and him is that her attack combo, her basic attack, does not reach quite as far as his, meaning that bum rushing the bosses is slightly more difficult, but other than that, you can pretty much just spam your enemies. In fact, it's even easier in this mode than it was in story mode, because in the arena there are 2 spirit power-ups and 2 health power-ups that will constantly respawn, making this entirely pointless. It's basically just a marathon, and you can beat it without any much trouble. The graphics of the game are okay, but pretty uninspired. The environments are very big and very empty, and quite honestly not that impressive. While they do look good for the system, they really aren't anything special. The character art and models, well, that's alright too. They at least look like the characters they're supposed to resemble. The art itself is alright, but the enemy sprites could just be anything. Even the bosses don't really look all that impressive. On the plus side, well, after you kill a boss, you usually do get to see a cool cutscene of them getting jumped by your hero. And that makes all the effort worth it, right? Right? Please tell me I'm normal. But one of the biggest disappointments for me personally is the music. I can't honestly call it terrible, but it is extraordinarily repetitive. It does try to mimic some of the background music from the show to varying degrees of success, but it's basically all just presented in a few second loops which repeat ad nauseum throughout the entire stage. It gets extraordinarily annoying. But one of the greatest disappointments about all of the music in this game is the fact that they don't take advantage of any of the songs that were in Yu Yu Hakusho, and they had some pretty good openings and endings. You're telling me you couldn't fit anything like Smile Bomb anywhere in there? Or perhaps Sayonara Bye Bye? Or if we really want to get into it, why not Unbalanced Kiss? With my back pressed against the weight of the world and the speed of the night, it's hard to lose the thread is snapping in you, and I hope you. This is probably the cheapest of cheap caching games that I have done on the show to date, and in fact it's probably one of the cheapest that I've ever played as well. It's boring, it is way too easy, and I will give them credit for at least knowing the material, but there was no way that they could make this engaging. Which I really don't understand, because they had a lot that they could have done, and a lot they could have worked with. Point being, if you really want something related to Yu Yu Hakusho, get the DVD collections, get the soundtrack, or get some of those cute little chibi action figures or something, because even that is a better spend of your money than spending it on this pile of tripe.
do.